All right, I'll give you a little bit of review. Remember, we talked about all these different things about why it is that Job serves God was probably the biggest idea. It's about the motives, right? It's not about the trials. Some of the reasons why we say it's not about the trials is because those first couple of critical verses, chapter 1, verses 7 and 8 and 9, really show us that the trials don't come to purify him. The trials simply come to isolate the more important question of why does he serve God? So that Satan and God are up there debating about, now why did he do that, right? Not I don't think it was blameless or upright, but why did he do it? Because that makes all the difference. So if that's what they're talking about in heaven, my guess it's a pretty critical thing for us now. So as we went through, we noticed, again, after the very first day, there was this ominous statement. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So, again, the point is, well, gee, I wonder if he's going to. And as we look through the dialogue, we find out, indeed, that is the case. Because the cycles of dialogue go something like this. Eliphaz speaks, and then Bildad, and, Eliphaz, and then Job, and then Bildad, and Job, and then Zophar, and Job. And what happens in this whole dialogue is simply this, that Job tends to win. And the purpose of the dialogue is simply that he clarifies his thoughts, he thinks it through, and he comes to some considered conclusions. And their conclusion, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, of course, their conclusion is that Job has sinned, and that's why he is being given this poverty in every sense, not just financial, but social and physical and all that sort of thing. And so he has done wrong, right? Which is a natural assumption to make. When someone undergoes the worst suffering of anyone ever in the world, it would be a pretty natural thing to think, well, you must have done something to deserve this. Right? None of us are sinless, so you must have done something. We didn't see it, but something was going on there, Job, and if you will just confess, then God will be good to you. We're sure of it. Of course, the Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar don't know what we know from chapter 1, that Job was blameless and upright and feared God and turned away from evil and didn't do anything to cause this. But the real kicker for us is that Job actually kind of believes in this too, and that Job finally comes to the point in chapter 19 where he says, I have been wronged. And what he means is not by Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, but by God. God has made a cosmic bookkeeping error. God has given me suffering when I didn't deserve it, and so God has done wrong. And as you simply do a quick summary of this argument in chapter 9, it's this very general, though one wished, right? In chapter 13, it becomes a first person. I desire to speak to the Almighty, argue this thing out with God and to put him on the witness stand. And by the time he gets to chapter 19, he's kind of even gone beyond that. He says, okay, I'm not even going to put him on the witness stand. I'm just going to condemn him as guilty. He has wronged me. Right? Though I cry out for justice, I get no answer, and God won't answer. Right? So he's really, really frustrated in all this. So the statement which was true in Job chapter 1 is no longer true. By chapter 19, he has sinned by charging God with wrongdoing. So I think that's where we left it, didn't we? Did we leave it right here at this spot? And I ask you, has Satan won? So I hope you gave it a moment's thought over the weekend. Has Satan won at this point? Yes or no? Has Satan won the big bet that took place way back in chapter 1? I got coffee. I don't know if you do or not, but I'm good. What do you think? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're saying we're moving in that direction, but we're not there yet? Or, yeah, okay. Another idea? Okay, no, that's a good distinction. He says Job has charged God with wrongdoing, but he hasn't cursed him. So what's the distinction in your mind between those two things? Yeah, cursing is not simply saying cuss words. Right? Cursing is actually turning away from God. So has Job turned away from God at this point? No, I don't think he has, right? So has Satan won? Again, I would say, well, maybe not yet. It's certainly going in that direction. Satan probably is pretty happy with where we are, but he hasn't quite, won the count yet. And here's why. If you take a look at where Job reflects after this, you'll see that he is still serving God. So watch this. Right? He talks about chapter 29 in the days past. He reflects on those and says, oh man, I remember the day when I was in my prime, when God's intimate friendship blessed my house. Young men saw me and stepped aside. The old men rose to their feet. The chief men refrained from speaking, covering their mouths with their hands. Like, have you ever been around a room or a place where somebody who was so important or had so much gravitas walked in, and everybody else just shut up when they came in? It's like, here's the guy, right? And then so Job says, man, that's what it used to be like. But now their sons mock me in song, and I've become a byword among them, right? They detest me and they keep their distance. So that's what it is, what it used to be, what it is now. But look at then chapter 31, where he still is, right? And Job says, look, here's where I still am. This is the way I'm choosing to live my life now. I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a girl. Now, when you talk about that kind of thing of immorality or lust, your mind usually goes to the Sermon on the Mount, right, where Jesus makes a big deal about this, where he says, you've heard it said, if you commit adultery, it's a bad thing. But I'm telling you, if you do this in your heart, right, it's the same thing. So a lot of people feel like what Jesus is doing is really raising the bar, saying it's not just the outward act, it's what's going on inside your heart too. Well, Jesus isn't really doing that. He's really agreeing with what Moses intended in the first place. But I just want to say here that Job gets that. Right? Job understands, even before the law was written, that God has this standard, which is a whole lot higher than just what you do on the outside. It's about what's going on in your heart. Right? So Job says, look, I'm still standing by this. If I've walked in falsehood or my foot has hurried after deceit, if I've denied justice to my menservants and maidservants and had a grievance against me, right? He is moral and he is just and he is merciful. I've denied the desires of the poor. Let the eyes of the widow grow weary. And you can think of all sorts of verses throughout the Bible that speak to this kind of thing, right? I mean, James says, true religion and undefiled is this, to look after the widows in their distress, right? And to keep yourself unspotted from the world. He's been loyal to God. I put my trust in gold, or if I said to pure gold, you are my security, but he hasn't done that, right? And all the way through here, Job was hospitable. No stranger had to spend the night in the street. That's a really important Middle Eastern value and should be for us as well. And this one maybe seem a little bit silly, but this is absolutely serious, and we just don't have a sense for it. But he handled the land well, right? He says, if my land cries out against me and all its furrows are wet with tears, what he means is if I haven't given the land its 7-year rest, right? And I keep working it too hard, he's saying I've stewarded the earth well. And this is a pretty important thing, right, in the Old Testament. And so in all of these ways, he's still serving God. So when we come back to that question, has Satan won? Based on the next couple of chapters, you have to say, well, not yet, at least, right? He hasn't cursed God. He's still serving God. He's just not sure why. He's just upset with God, right? He's just charged God with wrongdoing. So where do we go from here? We're still in an impasse, right? How does Job go forward from here? Because he's kind of had it out with Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, right? They've come to their conclusions, and Job, they've butted heads. And they clearly say, you've sinned. He says, no, I haven't sinned. God is wrong. And so that's like, okay, there's nothing else to say here. That's kind of where we are. So where do we go? And where we go is this. We go with this guy named Elihu. Now, Elihu is different than the friend we've seen before. The other friend, named E, started with E, was Eliphaz. Right? So this is a new guy. So Elihu comes along in chapters 32 to 37, and it's a fairly long speech. I'm not going to recount it all, but I'll hit the highlights. And here are the highlights. There are two main points. But Elihu is a younger guy. And he comes along and he says, look, I heard you old guys, not speaking derogatorily, I'll say it this way. I heard you wise men speaking, and I, as a young guy, didn't want to speak up. I wanted to let you guys have your say. So I've been listening carefully, and I've listened to all that you had to say, and now that you are finished with your saying, I will venture into the discussion. And what I would like to say are simply two things. Right? And the two things I want to say after listening to your whole dialogue here are these. Number one, I can't say that Job has sinned. Right? In contrast to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Right? Now, as he says this, is he right? Again, we're not talking about chapter 19. What we're talking about is the reason why the trials came in the first place, right? So when it comes to the big discussion of why did the trials come, Elihu comes along and says, I can't say this because Job has sinned. Is he right about this? Answer, of course, absolutely, right? This is where we came from in chapter 1. He did not sin. That's not why the trials came. So I would guess that Job's response to this is pretty positive, right? It's the first time in a long time he's had anybody take his side, right? And he's probably, rebuking Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar and saying, hey, look, you guys, look, this one young guy comes along. He's smarter than all three of you put together. You got to listen to him. He's smart. He knows what he's talking about. I didn't sin, right? And Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar mumbling, yeah, right. He didn't know either. Right? But then he says this. Then Elihu says this. Number one, I can't say Job has sinned. And number two, I can say that Job is not wrong. Or excuse me, that God is not wrong. Right? So he comes along here, and now he's speaking against Job. Right? He's saying, oh, look, Job, I don't know if you sinned or not, but I do know that what you said, that God has done you wrong, is not a good idea. Right? And now Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are saying, hey, maybe this kid is pretty smart, Job. Maybe you ought to listen to him. So what Elihu does is he kind of rocks the world of both of them a little bit, kind of sits them back on their heels so that maybe they're open up to some new truth. Is it possible that Job didn't sin in the first part? Is it possible that God is not wrong? It's like, well, neither one of us ever considered that kind of thing. And Elihu says, well, maybe you should. So what he basically does is he kind of pushes back against the errors of both of them and gets them ready then to listen to the actual climactic part of the entire book. And that comes in chapter 38 when Job gets what he asks for, kind of. What happens in 38, of course, is the interaction between God and Job. And so God shows up, and there, as you can tell here, from the outline, 1C, the first round. There are going to be 2 rounds in this heavyweight match. Okay? And in this first match, God shows up, and when I say Job gets what he's asking for, kind of, it's this. Job has asked, of course, that God would show up and that he could cross-examine him and he would, be tough and say, well, what about this and what about this? And then he says, put me on the stand, I'll answer, and that sort of thing. And it turns out a lot the way it does in our own lives. Maybe you've had this experience where you were really upset at work or some situation or at school, and you were talking to your friends and just giving that professor or that teacher or that boss whatever. And when he shows up, I'm going to tell him what I think, right? And the boss walks around the corner, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, did I hear my name? Do you have anything to say? No. All of a sudden, when the boss shows up, you don't feel quite so brave and courageous as you were bragging about before. And it's not just that. I mean, it's that on steroids, right? It's that on a billion times steroids when God shows up. Right? And God shows up, and all of a sudden, Job does not ask God any questions. Job does not put God on the stand. In fact, it's just the opposite. God is the one who asks all the questions, and God asks 70 questions. And what's really, at first, perplexing is that God doesn't answer any of the questions which Job had. Why'd you do this to me, and why'd you do this to me, and why is this unjust? God doesn't answer for himself at all. God says, no, those are not the questions that really need to be asked. There are other questions that need to be asked, and I'm going to ask you. And so God asks Job 70 questions. Now you think, no, wait a minute, how does that ever answer the problem? Well, it does, because God knows what the problem is and Job doesn't. So let's take a look at the way this thing goes. And we're going to start here in chapter 38. I want to put the text up here because I want you to see very carefully the connections in this whole speech between the first round and the second round, and again, the comparison between where we start and where we finish. It's really, really pretty important. It all begins like this. Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm, and he said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." All right? So, this kind of sets the tone here, and Job says, okay. And then he says, "Where were you?" Again, the title of my favorite song now, and it's going to be your favorite song soon when you get your heart right with Jesus. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" I mean, this is just such a powerful statement. I mean, you can't recreate this. It's impossible to recreate it. But let's just try just for a second, okay? It's my class, so let me be God, okay? Pretend that you're Job. And all of a sudden, God shows up, and he asks you this question. And he says, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" Right? What are you going to say to that? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched the measuring line across it, or where were its footings set, right? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? You were there, right? And you feel the sarcasm just dripping off of this. Where were you, Job? When I created everything, where were you? You saw that, didn't you? And what are you going to say if you're Job? Man, I wasn't there. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. I thought maybe you were there for a second. What's God doing here with him? And you read down through here, and it's not like, we just got off on the wrong foot. It's like that all the way. Who shut up the sea behind the doors? Or here's one of my favorites down here. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? What he's saying is this, Job, have you ever been on a camp out, where it's really cold and you were freezing at night and you kind of woke up and you were just hoping that the sun would come up and give you some warmth? Have you ever woken up at 3 a.m. and said, "Hey, sun, come up"? Have you ever given orders to the sun to come up like that, Job? Have you ever done that? Job says, well, I've wanted to. Yes, I've wanted to, but no. Every time I click my fingers, it never works. I can't get that sun to come up. Yeah, funny, isn't it, the way that works, right? And as you go all the way down through this whole passage, it's just like that. I mean, these verses are just, what is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed? And again, one of my favorites down here. Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Can you do that, Job? And then look at this, verse 35. Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Did they report to you and say, "Here we are"? I'll bet you, I was pretty sure, I wonder who did that. And I'll bet it's you, right? You're the one. You've been sending those lightning bolts on their way, haven't you? And Job's like, no, why is he asking me these questions, right? And then it's like God just enjoys the absurdity of this, and so he goes on to this statement about the ostrich. Notice this. We're in chapter 39. The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, but they can't compare with the pinions and feathers of the stork, right? Imagine you're Job here sitting and listening to this like, guys, where is he going now? She lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand, unmindful that a foot may crush them, and some wild animal may trample them. She treats her young harshly as if they were not hers. She cares not that her labor was in vain. Would you like to know why the bird does this, Job? Well, as a matter of fact, yeah, I would kind of like to know. He says this, because God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. I gave it a bird brain, Job. That's why it does that. So all these things you look at and you marvel at, I made them, right? That's what he's going for. And all the way through here, you get these questions that are just about nature. Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom? Does the eagle soar at your command? Now, what in the world is God getting at here? Why does he ask him all these questions? Well, the problem, I think, that Job doesn't quite understand, but which God sees, and so God really does come to answer, is this. That instead of the Creator being up here and the creation being down here, with Job being one of the created beings, what Job has done is he's kind of brought God down here and brought himself up to God's level, almost as though they were peers, right? Because the way he's spoken, he says, look, I want you, God, to come and sit on the trial seat, and I will ask you questions. And in fact, as he continued to move on, what Job has done is moved himself up here when he has actually condemned God for what he has done. You have done wrong. I'm going to judge you. You have done wrong, right? And what God is trying to do is to help Job see, no, it really isn't this way, Job. It's really more like this, and we really can't even begin the discussion until you understand where you fit on this whole scale, right? So these questions are designed to help Job understand a little bit about who he is. So at this point in the whole discussion, God says, okay, let's just take a little break and see how we're doing here, right? Let's evaluate our progress. And so that's where we are then in chapter 40 and verse 1, right? The Lord said to Job, now again, notice this, it's really critical. At this first round, God brings it up and says to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? That is, Job, you're the one who's contentious here. Are you going to correct me? Let him who accuses God of doing wrong answer him. So Job, what do you have to say for yourself? Then Job answered the Lord and said, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. Now, stop right there for a second and let's think about that. If Job says, okay, I'm going to stop talking. We'll switch the roles here. We'll let you be God for a second, okay? If you were God and he had condemned you and said that you had done him wrong, would you be content with this answer? I spoke once, but I won't say it anymore. I'll stop speaking. Is that good enough? See, I don't think it is. I think when he gets to this point and he says this, I don't think that's enough. And I don't think God does either. And that's why God says, okay, let's go back in round number 2. You're not ready yet, right? And I know that. I feel that way because when you take a look at the way the text goes, it goes like this, right? Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm, right? Remember, that's exactly what we saw in 38:1. Right? So this is like, here we go again. Right? And then he says again, the second time, verse 7, brace yourself like a man, I will question you, and you shall answer me. So here we go, round number 2. We're going to try this again and see if Job does any better this time. And he gets right to it, really to it. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Right? So he's at first, he was just talking about those kind of embarrassing questions, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? And now he gets right to it and says, would you condemn me to make yourself look good? Right? And then as we move on in chapter 40, do you have an arm like God's? Can your voice thunder like his? Why does he say that? Because that dynamic we said where Job feels like he is equal to God or greater than God, right? So God addresses it and says, if you feel like you're as good as God, can you do what God does? Can you bring proud men low? Can you make them humble? Can you crush the wicked where they stand? Can you do anything that's divine like Job? And then he goes back to this strategy of these animals. And there are 2 animals, verse 15, one called Behemoth, and over here in 41, one called Leviathan. Now, obviously, those are not names with which we are familiar. Those are not names, those are not even English at all, right? That's because no one knows exactly what these animals are. Behemoth and Leviathan are Hebrew words, and we don't even know the definition of them. And so the translators here are really cheating. They're really punting, right? They're saying, if you say, well, give us a good translation, it's like, we don't know, so we'll just give you the Hebrew, let you figure it out. Surely you know what it is, right? Because we don't have a clue what this is. And there's some descriptions of them. Some people think that they're, various animals. Some people have heard Ken Ham say that these are dinosaurs or something like that. And I have no idea what they are. I don't really care too much about what they are. What I care about is, why does God use them here? And the answer, I think, is best described like this. When I was 12 years old, I was a Boy Scout, and we loved our monthly campouts. And one time, one of the scoutmasters decided the best place for us to go camp out was not at the Boy Scout camping grounds or at a state park or a national park, but it would be a really, really good idea if we went to a farm. I had no idea why I thought that was cool, but they did. Of course, there were kind of fun things that we got into we weren't supposed to. And it was kind of fun. But anyway, where we stayed for this, where we put our tents was out in the middle of the field where there were a whole bunch of, like 50 head of cattle. We were a bunch of city slicker kids, we didn't know any better. We were from Indianapolis, and so we went out there and put our tents up, and when we walked out to our campsite, all of a sudden these cows decided we were the most interesting thing in the whole pasture, and they all came, around, like, and they were coming up to us, and like 50 of them, there were about 6 or 7 of us guys, and there were about 50 of them that formed this big semicircle and just like, kept coming closer and looking at us, like, and we were like, oh my gosh, what are they going to do? What are they? And they were so, we were 12-year-old boys, and they were like these big 2,000-pound cows, and they were coming closer, and it's like, oh my gosh, they're going to eat us right now. And there was this barbed wire fence behind us, and so we decided, hey, you know what, let's save our lives, let's scamper over the barbed wire fence, and we did, and we cut ourselves and ripped up our clothes a little bit, but by the time we got on the other side, we thought, praise God. Has God made a more fearsome animal than the cow? I don't think so. Because if you've ever been around big animals like that, they have a way of just making you feel really, really small. Right? And what God is doing here is saying, okay, look at this huge, huge animal. Doesn't that make you feel small? Like, if I don't make you feel small, at least being in front of the big physicality of the animal, does that make you at least feel like you're a helpless creature? And then he says this of Leviathan. Again, notice the sarcasm here. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fish hook? Obviously, some sort of animal lives in the water. Or tie down his tongue with a rope. Can you put a cord through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he keep begging you for mercy? Will he speak to you with gentle words? Will he make an agreement with you for you to take him as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of him like a bird or put him on a leash for your girls? No, you can't do any of that, right? So as Job has considered this then, notice how this one finishes, okay? And this one finishes over here in chapter 42 like this. And this is so significant that you notice the differences between round 1 and round 2. Again, the progression. Chapter 42, verse 1, then Job replied to the Lord. Now, can you tell me the difference between the first round and this one? How did the first round end? It may be kind of subtle, but it's pretty significant. The first round ended with God saying to Job, okay, what do you have to say for yourself? Does God say that to Job here? No. Job just volunteers it here. You see that? Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this that obscures my counsel without knowledge? Sure, I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. And here's what he says. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. I mean, look at the difference between the first round and the second, right? Up there he says, I will say no more. And down here he says, I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. You see the difference here? I mean, this is a huge difference, right? Before you said, okay, I'll stop talking. And now he says, man, I'm really sorry for what I said. Now, if we were to interview Job and say, no, Job, hold on here, wait for a second here. What are you repenting of? Because there was no sin to begin with. And he says, yeah, that's true. There was no sin to begin with. But there was sin in the book. There was sin in my life. And the sin was charging God with wrongdoing. And so again, just play the devil's advocate for a little bit and say, well, wait a minute, you didn't deserve that. And he says, look, let's not talk about deserving. Because the truth is, having gotten to know who God is in these last 4 chapters and have a sense of who the master and the sovereign of the universe is, I'm not going to pretend to know what is best for me. In fact, you know what? Just knowing who he is and being on his team is enough for me. Did he treat me wrong? No. My service to him does not depend upon how I'm treated. He can treat me in any way he wants to, because I know that he's too wise to do something foolish to me and too loving to do something really hurtful for me. I trust him completely with what he does with my life. So the story of Job really comes to us right here when you realize he says, I don't care what happens to me. I don't care what the results are. I don't care what the blessings may or may not be. It's not about any kind of paycheck at all. It's like just knowing who this is enough for me. So let's dig into this thing then and get after this whole idea of the motives, and let's just state it really clearly. If I serve God because it's good for me, I have to ask myself the question, am I serving Him at all? Right? So, for example, evaluate this sentence for me, okay? If I come to you and say to you, as your Bible professor, I say, look, I've thought about stealing, or I've thought about having an affair, and I've decided I'm not going to commit adultery today, because if I did, I could lose my job. Now let's think about that for a second, okay? If I said that and I meant that, and those are the words that I used, how would you evaluate that? I mean, I hope you would say, look, if that's the only reason you can think of not to commit sin, you're not serving God at all, right? I'm just looking out for my own self. And so it's not, again, so much what a person does as it is why that is so important, right? Satan would look down at that kind of thinking on my part and say, I've got him right where I want him. He's pretending to be all that, but deep inside he's just serving himself. And he could look at God and say, you don't have a personal relationship with him, you just have a business contract, and he's looking out for himself, and that's why he's doing what he's doing. You might think to yourself, again, are we going too deeply here? Is this really that important? And again, I would say, if this is what they're talking about in heaven, I think this is the only important thing. I love the way Dallas Willard has said this, and this is going to be some fairly heavy statement up here, so I write it out so you can see it, and I want you to think about it deeply. If you've never gone this far, you need to. If you've just, at this point, dependent upon your parents' faith, that's great, but, it's time to make your faith your own, and if you're going to make your faith your own, these are the questions you have to answer. Dallas Willard, one of my heroes in the faith, says this: the effect of both action and non-action for human approval is to push the presence of God aside as irrelevant and to subject ourselves to the human kingdom. What he's saying is, both action, if you do something good, or non-action, if you avoid some sort of sin, right? If you do that stuff just for human approval, you push God's power and God's presence aside, and you just subject yourselves to, what you can see. He says the same thing here. In both avoiding evil and doing good, our respect should be for God alone. Now here's the respectability trap that Satan sets and that we often fall into. We may think it is okay to avoid evil for fear of being seen, for in any case we do avoid the evil. But that only shows we have no respect for God and would disobey Him but for the opinions of others. You see the significance of this? I mean, I'm all happy about accountability groups. That's really, really good. But you know what? Your walk with God can't end there, because that's exactly the kind of thing he's talking about. It's okay to avoid evil for fear of being seen, for in any case we do avoid the evil, right? But if you say, okay, I'm not going to do this thing because I might have to confess this to my friends, or I would feel bad in front of them, what he's saying is, that only shows we have no respect for God and would disobey Him but for the opinions of others. So you say, is that me? Am I doing that, or am I not? Well, let me give you a test to figure out whether or not you fit in this category, okay? And don't take the test unless you want to know the answer. But if you want to know the answer, you can answer this thing carefully, okay? Here's the test. Let's think that whatever this temptation or sin is that has you, that you have a hard time with, imagine that you could do it and no one would ever know. That whatever the temptation that grabs you, you could get away with it and no one would know. If you knew that were the case, if I could make that happen that no one would ever find out, would you do it? And however you answer that question determines and lets you know who you're really serving. So let me come back and say this. Just get right to this point. Let's think about tomorrow morning when you wake up. Imagine that God is asking you this question. Will you be blameless and will you be upright? And I hope that as we've gone through the class, you understand that that's an important question, but that's not nearly the most significant question. Are you going to be blameless? Are you going to be upright? And I hope the answer is yes, I will do these things. I will live in a way that honors God. But you realize that the much more important question is this one, number 2, why? If I'm going to be blameless and upright because that's the way society does it around here, and that's what's honored around here, and that's how your social standing increases around here, who are we really serving? But if I can say, look, because of my relationship with Him, because of my awareness of God's presence, I don't care what happens or doesn't happen to me on the outside, I will serve Him no matter what because He's too good to do anything incredibly harmful for me. Now, as people come to this book, they're often concerned about the presence of evil. It's another one of the issues. And even here, I think the answer is this. You might still walk away kind of with this nagging thought, thinking, wow, did God really do him right? And my answer to that would be, I don't know. Why don't we interview Job? I mean, what do you think Job would say? After all was said and done, and you said to Job, hey, would you like to do that again? What would he say? He probably would say something like this, based upon how he answered in chapter 41 and 2. He'd probably say something like this, it was really painful, and I didn't enjoy it, but I would never give up that experience or anything. Because he says, before I kind of heard about God, but now I feel like I know Him face to face, and I have this relationship with Him that's deeper. So if you look at the trials and sufferings that were brought in, Satan has this agenda to really derail him, and yet as Job responded correctly, ultimately, those trials did ultimately bring him into a deeper relationship with God because of the way he responded. So that in the preview, when we talked about one of the things this book will do is help us understand how to pray for believers in Afghanistan and China and India, right? Places where there is incredible suffering. What is the right thing to do? I think the right thing to pray is, God, give them grace to respond correctly in the trials. Because if God simply says, God has wronged me, he can go off the rails, right? But if Job responds correctly and says, wow, look what God is doing here, I will serve him no matter what, that makes all the difference in how the story actually ends. So the thing I want you to walk away with is this discussion, is this focus on the motives and why we're serving him and what's really going on inside of our hearts. All right? So let me then talk to you a little bit about the paper I want you to write. Now, if you look in Moodle under week number 8, because that's when it's due. I don't think we're not in, well, actually this is week number 8, isn't it? Yeah, okay, that's where we are anyway. There are directions, first of all, for all 3 reaction papers, because we have reaction papers on Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. Those other ones aren't going to take place for a while, but all the directions are here. There is also, number 2, an article by Larry Crabb for the Job reaction paper. Notice this article is not necessary for the paper. It's only here in case you need something else to get your ideas flowing. Right? So you don't need to read that at all. You really do not need to read that, right? If you have enough to go on now, and hopefully you will, you can do that. But if you get stuck and think, well, I just need something else to kind of stir up my thinking, you can read the one by Crabb. Number 3 up here, Job reaction paper, that's where you actually submit it. But let me show you what the directions for all 3 reaction papers look like. And I'm just going to go to, let me go somewhere here where we got it in PDF form, got it written up. So let me explain these directions to you, and I want to do this because there is absolutely no reason why everybody here can't get full credit on this assignment. And I don't mean to have a serious scolding tone at all, but I really want you to get full credit, and there's no reason not to, okay? So please, please, please just do what I'm asking you to do here. Right? Notice these things. Number 1, here's a summary. All I want you to do is write a 750-word reaction paper to the book, to the message of Job, addressing the questions raised by the book about our motives for serving God. Right? So the best way to do that, of course, is to write this thing out, not in Moodle, because do you understand that there are sensors in Moodle that are built into the software that when you spend a whole lot of time working on something, and if it knows that's the only place it is, it'll crash. It'll do that, right? So don't trust Moodle. Write this out in Word. You can get your syntax and grammar, all vocabulary right and spelling right, which is kind of important. And you'll also know what the word count is too, okay? And then once you got it there, you save it, and then you copy and paste it into Moodle when the time comes. So anyway, it's a 750-word reaction paper. Letter B, it is not a research paper. You don't need to cite outside sources. I don't want you to cite outside sources. I don't want you to go anywhere else. I want you just to work with the message of Job as you've gotten it here, right? There's the statement. Again, here's the statement. If you need extra help, you can go to Larry Crabb, but you don't really need to do that. Here's the grading. The form will be worth 2 points. Demonstrating the message of the book of Job is worth 3 points. And number 3, honest reflection of your own experience is worth 5 points. Okay? So 10% off per day. It's late, so if you don't get it done on time, we'll just do it the next day. If you don't get it done, do it the next day, right? And you got to do it before it's 10 days late, otherwise it won't be worth anything. But here's the point. Here is the rubric we're going to use. So for the form and length, which is worth 2 points, if you don't want any points for that, then just do poor or disorganized writing, write less than 500 words, and have several grammatical errors. You'll get 0 points for the form. Right? If you'd like 1 point, then have less than 750 words, a few misspellings. If you'd like 2 points, then just give me 750 words that's spelled right and punctuation and grammar's good. That's all there is to it. If you do it in a word, you'll probably be fine. Now, the second point is this. Understand the message of Job. Now, the thing I do not want you to do is to retell the story of Job or the message of Job. I actually know what that is. Right? So you don't have to tell me again. When I say here, understand the message of Job, what I mean is by what you tell me, I know that you've been here in class. You know what the big ideas are. Right? So I want you to talk to me about motives. So if you, again here, if you misunderstand the proper relationship between motives and trials, 0 points. If you understand the relationship between motives and trials, that the trials are not really the thing, the trials just bring out the motives, right? Then you'll be fine. So the first, the way to miss those points is say, man, God brought a lot of trials in my life and they have purified me because of the suffering. No. You're missing the point about motives here. Okay. So then, finally, the honest self-reflection. Again, this is really, really key, and the reason why I go over it is because we've done this for a lot of years, and unless I go over it, people just don't somehow listen. Okay. So, if you want 0 points for honest self-reflection, then make no effort to connect the book with real life. If you want 1 point, make general observations about the Christian life. If you want 3 points, make cliched observations about your own life. If you want 4 points, general observations about your own life. If you want 5 points, make some insightful and thoughtful observations about your own life in the book.